Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Got a great episode for you today. Alexander Poots wrote a book called The Stranger's House. It's about writers in Northern Ireland from the partition to the Troubles and kind of a little bit further. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. We're going to explain that. It was a really great conversation. Alex really dug into why he wrote this book. It's his very first book. It's very exciting. And, you know, we tiptoe around a lot of Northern Ireland stuff, which can get very, very complicated, very, very heated. We don't go too deep into it, but we kind of give everyone an idea of what it's like and a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the unfortunately terrible things that have been done and have happened there, but also why people love Ireland so much, why these writers decided to take these pieces from growing up and how they wrote all of this stuff together. It's really interesting. I hope you enjoy it. Let me shut up so you can see if you enjoy it or not. I think you will. Here we go. Alexander Poots. And here we are, Alexander Poots and his book, The Stranger's House, Writing Northern Ireland. Alex, thanks so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Brendan. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You are number one in one category for authors. I could find dang near nothing on you on the internet. An international man of mystery, I think you dubbed yourself.
Yeah, that's the way we like it. Yeah.
So now, here's what I do know. You were born in London, and now you're in Belfast.
That's right.
Fill in a little bit for me in between. How'd you start in London? How long were you there? How'd you end up in Belfast?
Yeah, so I was born in London. My dad's from Belfast, and my mum is sort of an English-Scottish mongrel. Though I wouldn't say that to her face. And I lived there most of my life, went off to uni. After I'd done that, I worked as a bookseller for a long time, and mainly in bookshops in central London. And I suppose writing this book's probably the first thing that I've done that will leave any kind of digital footprint, I suppose. So that's why you came back with a clean rap sheet, I suppose, for the moment anyway. After I've been bookselling for a while, like most booksellers, I suppose, I've been writing a bit on the side. I was in charge of the history section at work. One of the weird things about doing that is that you spend most of your time actually shelving books rather than doing much else. And I noticed that, in a sense, there was sort of a gap on those shelves. Now, of course, in the Irish history section, there were shelves and shelves of books on the Troubles and Irish history more broadly. And if you walked over to the poetry and literary criticism section, there were a great many books, of course, on Seamus Heaney and other Northern writers. But I found it strange, I suppose, that no one had really tried to put together a little narrative history, I suppose, of Northern writing, going from just before partition, really, with authors like C.S. Lewis, who many people to this day don't know was born and raised in Belfast. Going from people like Lewis all the way through partition and out the other side into the period of history that we now know as the Troubles, which of course produced some of the finest writing, not only in Irish letters, but in sort of the broad spectrum of world literature in the late 20th century as well. So I got to thinking about that, and that gap sort of started to niggle at me a little bit. And eventually I sort of thought, well, no one else appears to be doing this and filling this gap, so I may as well have a crack at it. And so that's what I did. And many years later, because of course all our lives have been somewhat disrupted recently, the book is finally out there.
Now, let's go over some definitions, just because I grew up around a lot of, straight off the boat Irish people, so I do know these definitions. But for those who don't know, you said, for instance, partition. When you say partition, what does that mean?
So this is the moment when, after 400 years of British colonialism on the island of Ireland, the combination of the strain placed on the British Empire by the First World War and a resurgent Republican movement, which of course had its most famous expression in the Easter Rising of 1916 in Dublin, meant that the British government sort of went, actually, okay, we can't keep a lid on this anymore. and it's time to heed Ireland's call for self-determination. Now, of course, this was all very carefully couched in the attitudes of the time. So what we now think of independence, that's not really what was on offer from the British government. What they actually said was that you can govern yourselves, but you'll remain a dominion of the British Empire. So already quite a complicated situation, because in the south of Ireland, there were some who sort of thought, well, actually, that's the best offer we're going to get, so we should accept it. And there were others who said, well, actually, no, being a dominion of the British Empire is still recognising crown authority. We're having none of that. At the same time, you've got a really big problem, because in the 17th century, the British Crown had settled thousands of people from England and Scotland in the province of Ulster. Now, they did that because Ulster in the 17th century was the real heart of Gaelic resistance to British rule. 400 years later, those thousands of colonists have turned into nigh on 1 million people who are primarily Protestant and who primarily view themselves as being part of the empire of the United Kingdom, who really did not see themselves fitting in very well into an independent Ireland, which was almost certainly going to be Gaelic-orientated and a place that was going to be centred on the Catholic Church, which, you know, and De Valera's Island did end up sort of going down that path, particularly with church authority in Ireland. So there's a big problem. What are you going to do about those 1 million people? Because apart from anything else, they're not messing around. You know, these are not the effete, laptopping, email junkie type men that you see around the place today. Many of these men had served in the First World War. They knew their way around a rifle. They were highly motivated. And the Irish Civil War that took place in the south between pro and anti-treaty factions could have been a whole lot worse, because you'd have added a third contingent into that mix, which was a highly motivated and highly organised military body of Northern Protestants as well. So the answer, as ever in British politics, the solution was something of a fudge. They decided, well, okay, the way forward here is to partition the island of Ireland. And those 1 million Northerners can be given their own mini-state in the northeast of the island. And that way, everyone gets what they want. Well, of course.
Oh, no, wait, it solved everyone's problems, right? There was no issues from that point on. We're going to do the partition and everyone is cool with it, right? Oh, wait, didn't you say something about troubles? There was troubles? The troubles? What were those?
Yes. It's fair to say that things did not go according to plan. Of course, the main problem was that whilst this pleased the Protestants in the north, there are also significant numbers of people who identified as Irish, were Roman Catholics, and they were living in the north to probably around a third of the population when partition occurs in 1921. About a third of the population of the newly minted Northern Ireland are Irish and Catholic in identity terms. And of course, what happens then is you have a Protestant state which realises that it's very small. Ireland is a tiny island. Northern Ireland is a tiny, tiny country. If you drive north to south, you can do it in an hour and a half. East to west, we're talking 2.5 hours. If we had American-style freeways here, I mean, it would be far less. So from the get-go, the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland did face discrimination. The first Northern Irish parliaments were very, very careful, for example, when they set electoral boundaries to make sure that Catholic-dominated areas essentially had fewer votes than the Protestant-dominated areas near to them. So this was all a way of ensuring that there would be a Protestant unionist majority that was always going to be in charge of Northern Ireland. Right from the beginning, you had, upon partition in 1921 and 22, you had a space of riots and really, unpleasant, violent persecution of the Catholic minority, particularly in Belfast, where, for example, Catholic workers in the shipyards were told that their services were no longer required in no uncertain terms.
I'm sure there are people listening, especially our Irish Catholic listeners. Yes, we're skipping a lot. That is not what this episode is about. I'll have to do one of those episodes at some point to try and unravel any of this, but this is the world that you start looking at your, Belfast, Northern Ireland writers. I mean, my first question for you is, it's a little bit of history. It's a little bit of just straight looking at poetry, but I think it gets filed, this book, under literary criticism, which I've always wanted to ask. I think when people hear that, they go, oh, so you're just going to rip apart somebody else's work? That seems kind of messed up. But that's not really what you're doing here. Can you tell me kind of your definition of literary criticism to kind of key people up to understand what they're going to read here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think literary criticism, if it's done well, tries to deepen the poem or the novel that's in front of you. Certainly, it should try to place it in context as well for other readers. I know exactly what you mean when you say ripping apart, because there's always that temptation. I think, particularly within certain academic circles, there's this desire to take Herman Melville or I don't know, Thomas Pynchon or James Joyce and just absolutely, rip them apart and destroy them as objects of beauty and even fun. But no, I think literary criticism, when it's done well, really it's about helping your readers to enjoy what's in front of them. Really, it's sort of as simple as that. And anything that fails to do that, I think, is wrong and should be stamped out immediately. But I mean, sadly, open any academic journal and you'll see the most sort of joyless and frankly pointless eviscerations of other people's work. It's a real shame, but that's the industry, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, what Instagram was built for, as far as I can tell.
Right,
it's just ripping apart everything, not just writing. But I really liked is, because I'll be honest, I kind of went into the book, and I say this, I went into the book and I'm kind of like, all right, what am I going to read exactly? Is it just going to be this kind of, sometimes literary criticism, it's also very dry, unless you're going for it, right? This felt like comfort food is the best way I can describe it. I mean, you start off with very, very, very famous writer, Northern Irish writer, and it seems like the first part of it is very rooted in, this is what Ireland looks like. And if you live there, just being here, the ocean, the rivers, the green is going to inform you as a writer. And that kind of seems like the entry point into the book. Was that kind of your focus when you first started looking at this?
Yeah, I think the Irish landscape particularly is certainly one of the threads that's throughout the book, because it's quite difficult to think of any writer I talk about in the book that doesn't actually see the landscape as being some sort of a key into what's going on. And that can be quite a source of literal one, in the sense that many of Ireland's problems have centred quite literally on the land. There isn't enough of it. And you have two rival communities scrapping over it. I was talking to a friend a few months ago, and he said, my mum's really annoyed. I said, at the moment. I said, why? And his mum's a doctor. She works in Belfast, but she's from Tyrone. And she had decided that she was finally going to sell off some fields which had been left to her by her father, but she'd inherited them, hadn't really known what to do with them. And she'd finally gone, look, I'm never going back. I'm never going to go and build a wee house on those fields. It's silly me owning them. I'll sell them. And so she did. She put them up for sale. The next thing that happens is that a distant relative of hers who still lives in Tyrone phones her up in a fury. She says, why are you so annoyed? And he says to her, you sold those fields to a Catholic. Did you not ask the estate agent what the name of the person was that you were selling the fields to? And she said, of course it was on the contract, but I don't really care, to be honest. But her relative was genuinely, fuming, because she had ceded these, I think it was a very small parcel of land, really, 3 or 4 fields, small fields. But he was absolutely fuming. From his perspective, she had failed in her first duty, which was to ensure that in that small community, the sort of the balance of land ownership didn't shift. Land in a very literal sense, and landscape in a very literal sense, is hugely important. But of course, it also gains immense metaphorical power, particularly as the Troubles continued, actually, because thinking of, for example, Heaney in this collection North writes a series of poems based around bodies that were exhumed both in Scandinavia and in Ireland, bodies which had been buried in the medieval period in peat bogs. Peat is highly acidic, which means that the human body doesn't really decompose as it normally would. Instead, they sort of end up pickled. And the exhumation of these bog bodies had an enormous impact on him. Partly because, particularly with the Irish bodies, he felt he knew those faces. He felt a deep connection to those people. But at the same time, Heaney is writing these poems about the bog bodies. You also have people who are being removed from their homes and shot and buried in shallow graves, both Protestants and Catholics, people who were being disappeared by the Provisional IRA. And so the bodies multiplied. And where do those bodies end up? Back in the land that everyone obsesses over the course of Irish history. And so that's a very long answer to a short question about why the landscape. But I do think the landscape is key. And there's a very good reason why I very much doubt there's a single poet or novelist I discuss in the book who doesn't have a real affinity for the landscape and a real curiosity about what it means. Because it's beautiful, but there's a real darkness to the landscape here as well, because there's barely a quiet country road that hasn't seen real, genuine horror.
I mean, to take that thread and go off on a bit of a tangent, I don't think you can talk about anything Irish and say it in a short way.
Right.
At the beginning of this, almost lightly go through and talk about, the partition and the Troubles, just kind of lightly. But I mean, if you want to do either of those things any justice, there is a lot of horror, there's a lot of terror. I've tried to read a few books on Irish history, and it's one of those things where you can't just jump in at like 1940 and figure out what's going on. You said provisional IRA. There's a lot of IRAs. They have different names, and they come from different places, and they believe very different things, and they, let's just say, do things in a very different way. You can't just start with the IRA because you have to start with, why did the IRA even happen in the first place? Yeah. And then you're going back hundreds upon hundreds of years. And I always think about the fact that, my very Irish family, we have a saying that I'm sure a lot of Irish families have, which is never let the truth get in the way of a good story as well. Right? You make it as outlandish and fun as possible, no matter how dark it is. But I was thinking about that as I'm reading you go through these poems and everything like that, where there can be that very serious piece of what somebody's writing, but then they might write something really funny right after that. Like it's that yin and yang in that you can't just do a short summary of any of this stuff. You have to dig into it. Otherwise, you're just missing huge pieces, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most interesting pieces I've read on Northern Ireland actually was written by Brendan Behan. He wrote a very famous book called Borstal Boy, which he was a dub. He was captured at Liverpool docks in the early 20th century with a sort of a caseload of bomb-making materials and was arrested and was, because he was a minor, he wasn't sent to prison in England. He was sent to a borstal, which is sort of a young offenders institute. So he wrote a very famous autobiography about his experiences there, which I think was probably leavened with all sorts of mythopoeic additions. When he got back to Ireland as an adult, he spent a lot of time working in what's now Northern Ireland as a lighthouse painter. And after he'd finally achieved fame in the 1960s, he wrote a book called Brendan Behan's Island. And in some ways, it's a bit of a silly book. It's clearly a money-making exercise. It's sort of a coffee table book that I think he probably dashed off quite quickly. But his interpretation of Northern Ireland is really interesting, not least because it happens, he was writing in the 60s. So this is before the Troubles really get going. But it's very, very funny. He argues, in fact, that there isn't much difference between a Dublin man and a Belfast man. He talks, for example, about going to the pub in Sandy Row, which is a very famous Protestant part of Belfast. Certainly 10 years later, a man with a Dublin accent would not be drinking in Sandy Row. But Brendan Behan's Island, it's well worth looking up actually if you can, because it is very funny, and he was a very dark man in many ways. But you're absolutely right about the yin and yang of the thing, and how, you know, for every dark offering from someone like Seamus Heaney, there's probably a Brendan Behan somewhere in the background cackling away at some sort of inexpressibly dark little bon mot.
You mentioned Haney. We got a few others in here. How did you decide, right? Because we talked about it's a lot. How did you decide who was going to make it into the book? Were these just your personal favorites? Did you pick them because you felt they kind of bridged an entire time period? How did you make those decisions?
I knew several things. I knew that I wanted the book to make sense as a narrative. Now, I had to be quite careful about that, because the last thing I wanted to do was to force a narrative. And you quite rightly just said Irish history in particular is incredibly complicated. I like to say if American history is a bit like a sausage, you start at one end and you end up at the other. I mean, Irish history is just a bowl of spaghetti dumped on the table. So I did have to be careful about that. But I also knew that I did want to trace a line from pre-partition to, you know, the late 90s, essentially. And so that informed a lot of the choices. But I also knew that I wanted some people in there who maybe haven't got the recognition they perhaps deserve, or people that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily expect to be writing in a place like Northern Ireland. So Forrest Reid, who I devote the second chapter to, is an example of that. I also go on a little tangent about Oscar Wilde, which, I mean, it's a very small part of the book, but I found the fact that he'd gone to school in County Fermanagh in the north of Ireland really interesting, and even more so the fact that Sir Edward Carson, who was the primary architect of the partition of Ireland, the creation of the Northern Irish state, he was the man who effectively demolished Wilde in court. There were certain areas where I just felt there were some things that were too good to leave out, I suppose, as well. Little moments like that.
Did you have to take their religion into account when you were picking people? You know, just because of what we've talked about. Did you have to say, hey, they can't be all Catholic, they can't be all Protestant, I have to kind of get a swath of both?
Fortunately, it shook down pretty equally. But actually, when I finished the first draft, a friend of mine actually made a joke about that, and he sort of said, I hope you've got enough of us in there, Alex. And in his case, that meant Catholics. And so I sat down, I was like, okay, C.S. Lewis, prod. Forrest Reid, prod, and then I started going, oh shit. But then by the time you get to the Troubles, actually, it's the balance is very much redressed. And I mean, actually, whilst there were, you know, very accomplished Protestant poets and dramatists, John Hewitt is a biggie who I don't really go into in the book. W.R. Rogers is another one who I'm sure some real Northern Irish lit fanboys will be outraged that I don't really talk about Rogers, but there you go. I suppose it starts off perhaps a little prod heavy, but by the end, I think the balance is more than redressed. But no, you're right. It's the sort of thing you do have to think about, because you want to write a book that's fair and that represents the situation on the ground, and the situation on the ground is a real mosaic, and it's incredibly diverse and incredibly complex, and any book that didn't at least try to capture that would just be a complete failure, and then I could never have faced my Belfast dad ever again.
Here's a question for you of your main characters throughout the book, right? You mentioned a couple minor ones that don't in there, but your main characters, the big ones. I have two questions. Number one, if you could only read one of their works for the rest of your life, you had to eliminate everybody else, you had to pick one whose words you get to read the rest of your life, which one would you pick?
Perhaps a controversial choice. I think I'd go with Patrick Kavanagh. Perhaps an odd figure to have in the book anyway, because eagle-eyed readers will notice that he's from Monaghan, which is in the Republic of Ireland. The reason I put him in there was because whilst Monaghan ended up south of the border, it is part of the ancient province of Ulster. 3 of Ulster's provinces ended up south of the border. The reason I wanted him in there was as a representative, I suppose, of sundered Ulster, because partition doesn't just divide the island, it divides the province of Ulster as well. And Kavanagh's experience down in Dublin was very much, first of all, as a country person who was sort of in this world of literary sophisticates, which is a world that Dublin still does very well, by the way. So he was also a northern man, you know. The reason I would choose Kavanagh is, first of all, I love his poetry. I think his poem Epic, which I quote in the book, is among my favourite poems, a poem that essentially contends that it's the small and perhaps seemingly insignificant events in life from which grand dramas can be pulled out, which I think is a lovely sentiment, but also quintessentially, I would suggest, Irish sentiment as well. I also love his, what I think we can call literary criticism. He was just hilarious. I mean, he didn't care. He didn't play the game, that sort of very careful Dublin literary game. The stories about him are legion. There's one story which is possibly apocryphal, but it's I don't care. It's too good not to talk about. When his novel Tarry Flynn came out to a rather muted reception, he was walking past one of Dublin's more famous bookshops and noticed that there weren't any copies in the window. His response to that was to go in and remonstrate with the bookseller who refused to place any copies in the window. So Patrick Kavanagh's solution to that was to smash the window. He was a poet of the old school in that sense. I love his I suppose, literary criticism, his critical writing, because he was completely fearless. He didn't really care. He wasn't perhaps the most subtle of critics, but for example, he loathed W.B. Yeats. He thought that the cult of Yeats was disgusting. I mean, in a famous line, he said Yeats, of course, wasn't really Irish at all. He'd spent most of his life in London. This, of course, is a very common theme, by the way, in Irish letters. It's all of these Irish writers constantly trying to de-Irish one another, right? So you're constantly... So Lou McNeice isn't Irish because he's from a Protestant family in the north and he went to school in England. Yeats isn't Irish at all because actually his entire sensibility is English. But Kavanagh would be my choice. There's this wonderful volume of his critical writings called Collected Prose, which if you ever type that in a Word document, as I've done many times, autocorrect is not your friend. It's constantly correcting it to prose, but it's prose. And it's one of the great outrages, I think, that book is now out of print. I'd love to own a copy, but if you go on 8 books, they're all 300 quid or more. That book alone, I think it's a masterclass in how to write about poems, other people's, but also the business of making them. I feel an immense sympathy for the man who I suspect wouldn't have liked me very much, but I love him.
So second part of that question, because whenever you're talking about writers, I think this very often changes people's answers. If you could meet any one of these main characters at the pub for a few hours, which one would you pick?
There are lots of great pub stories about Kavanagh. I think because I know those stories, I wouldn't pick him. Yeah, I mean, going to the pub... I mean, C.S. Lewis could knock it back, you know.
I mean, that was my thinking. I know it's an easy answer. I mean, the dude had an imagination at the very least.
He had an imagination, and he was famous for his beer consumption. He could really knock it back. I think I would probably end up having to go for Lou McNeice, though, another committed drinker. But if you could get a word out of him, it would be a very interesting word. But yeah, I suspect you'd have to lubricate him with large quantities of fine wines before you'd get anything out of him. But yeah, I think I'd have to go with McNeice, actually, if nothing else, because the insults he would come out with would be highly memorable.
You know, there are certain things you have to be careful about when you're writing about this stuff. And so in the beginning, it's a little bit easier, right? Because you are focusing on the land, and especially the very first part of the book, you were talking about the actual land, what it looks like, and how it permeates into these poems. Towards the end, you get to the troubles, as you talked about. How difficult is it to pull these authors out at that time, right? Because you've got to balance everything. It's clear to me that you also chose authors who you love all of their work. You didn't pick somebody who's kind of like, well, he fills in the narrative, but forget this guy, right? Like everybody who you pulled into this, is clearly somebody that you have an affection for. But when you get to the Troubles, if you pick one person, they may have written this one thing that pissed off half the country, and then there might be those things. How do you balance that to make sure that, you're writing a book, you don't want people to shut it and say, I'm done with this? How do you balance all of those needs?
Well, first of all, I think when you're writing about Northern Ireland, the first thing you have to do is accept that there will be some readers who shut the book and say, I'm done with this. That's almost a given with a subject like the Troubles. You are never going to write a book that everyone is happy with. And frankly, if you did, it wouldn't be a book worth reading because it would be so safe and so boring and so without colour and texture that actually, wouldn't be worth writing in the first place. What's really interesting about writers of this level, and all of the writers in this book, I think, are first class. Writers working on that sort of level, particularly those who were working during the Troubles, so we're talking Maeve McGuckian, Seamus Heaney, of course, Derek Mahon, Michael Longley, they're all faced with a real problem. And it's a variant of the question you just asked me. You can't look at this stuff as a writer and not address it. But equally, addressing it could feel either like you're trying to cash in on it, which is essentially means cashing in on the pain and suffering of your neighbours, perhaps even your extended family, because this is a very small place. And whilst 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles, in a small place like Northern Ireland, that sort of level of death has an incredibly profound effect on people. So they were faced with a really big problem. And occasionally I close the book with a poem by Michael Longley called Kinder Totenlieder, which means songs for dead children, effectively, which he wrote about the murder of the young boy Patrick Rooney during a riot in the late 60s, where a police officer let off a machine gun, effectively, in a civilian area, which ended up striking this poor child in the head. How do you write about something like that? Because you can't ignore it either, not really, not if you're a morally engaged person. So these were incredibly serious, weighty moral problems that all of these poets were wrestling with. And the answers they came up with were various, and I hope I do them all justice in the book. But a lot of it, of course, there's that traditional poetic tactic, which is to retreat into metaphor, I suppose, and also to retreat into the past and to use the past to talk about things that would perhaps be too raw were they to be couched in the present day. For example, Heaney's poem about Wolfe Tone, one of the United Irishmen and a key figure in the Rising of 1798. It's much easier to write a poem about the sang-froid displayed by Wolfe Tone than it is perhaps to write about the hunger strikes of 1981. So that's one way. We've talked about the land, and land is another metaphor that is, as I've said, continually present. But also you've got people like Maeve McGuckian, and I mean, in her wonderful poetry, she occasionally writes poems that are, I don't know why, but when I'm reading her, I often think about a shattered window, not shattered so that there's air pouring in, but just cracked, perhaps. That image constantly returns to me, this idea of a fine pane of glass with cracks running through it. Now, that doesn't tell you much about her poetry, perhaps, in terms of its content, but I hope it perhaps tells you something about the effect her poetry can have. Often perhaps quite abstract poetry, but necessarily so, I think, because often, not always, but often her poetry does centre on the, at that time, seemingly never-ending cycle of violence that was taking place in Northern Ireland. And that was her solution to it, a kind of abstraction and an attempt to write poems which perhaps aimed to produce a particular kind of feeling in the reader rather than sort of leading you through a narrative.
It's also to kind of break up the boys' club, so to speak, as you go through the book too, because it's very male heavy in the beginning, and then you finally kind of see this birth towards the end of the book of where women's voices are starting to be heard on all of this stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are a lot of men in this book. Part of that is largely structural. who went to university in the 1940s? Well, overwhelmingly men. So the kind of people who had, if you like, poetic educations at university, which in turn then gave them the opportunity to approach publishers and so on and so forth. Yeah, it is broadly men. So towards the end of the book, Anna Burns, of course, winner of the Booker Prize, I talk about her novel Milkman. Now things are on a much more level pegging, but it certainly wasn't always so.
Now, a really, really important question. I need you to get this one right. I am a terrible descendant of Irish folk and have not been to the motherland yet. So when I finally do that, if I do come up north, if they let me in, I'm not quite sure yet, but if they do, will you show me around?
Of course, I will take you on the mother of all pub crawls around Belfast.
Perfect.
And then I'll pack you off on the bus the next morning looking suitably bilious. That's my promise to you, Brendan.
Perfect. That was the correct answer, and I really appreciate that. So, Alex, one last question, and this is what I ask of every author, right? There's a little bit of history, a little bit of literary criticism. People hear this, and they're like, I learned all that at school. It bored the hell out of me, right? So you got somebody who's like, I don't read history. I don't read literary criticism. Why should I read your book? What would you say to them?
Because this is a story about humans and what they're capable of doing to one another. And I don't care where you're from or who you are or whether you like reading or whether you like poems or not. You need to read about what humans are capable of, both the bad, but also occasionally the good. I don't know about you, Brendan, but I look around and I see a world which seems to me increasingly fragmented. Whilst I think it would be inappropriate to draw a direct link between the Troubles and where we are now, I do think that we should recognise that much of what we believe to be deep divisions perhaps are not necessarily so. And when you look about a society that is genuinely at odds with itself, as was and to a certain degree still is the case in Northern Ireland, I think actually sort of maybe realise that a lot of the ballyhoo on Twitter and in the media perhaps isn't worth the time of day, shall we say. Does that make sense?
No, not at all, Alex. I'm from America where we agree on everything.
I was thinking of your great nation when I was speaking just then.
Every now and again, a minor disagreement here and there. I mean, I think we only have one political party now. I think it's just the one. Alex, thank you so much for coming on. It's a fantastic book. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brendan. It's been such a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Alex, thank you so much for coming on The Stranger's House. Go out and get it, folks. You'll like it. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Please leave us reviews. Give us 5 stars. All of that stuff really, really, really helps us. Hit us up on Instagram, all of those places. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, do little history nerd nuggets for you, right? I think they're pretty funny, they're cool, and they're real. So hit us up. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.